heading up to the code 3 chase. Suspect was last reported southbound on Highway 99.
Can you give me more info on that call?
Sheriff Robert Harlan's 23 years with the Creston County Sheriff's Department had hardened him to most of what the job could throw his way. The rural Montana county stretched over thousands of square miles of rugged terrain, much of it wilderness, and he'd seen everything from grisly hunting accidents to domestic disputes gone horrifically wrong. But nothing in his career prepared him for what happened during that blizzard in February 2018. The call came in just after midnight. A motorist had reported seeing headlights veering off Route 12 near the old Blackwood property, about 40 miles from town. With roads rapidly deteriorating under 8 inches of fresh snow and more falling, Harlan knew waiting until morning wasn't an option. He radioed Deputy Collins that he'd handle it himself since he lived closer to that area. The Blackwood property hadn't been occupied in nearly a decade. The last owners had abandoned it after a series of financial setbacks, leaving behind a crumbling farmhouse and several outbuildings that local teens occasionally used for parties. Harlan had chased trespassers off the land more times than he could count. But tonight, with temperatures dropping to -15 and visibility near zero, he doubted anyone would be there by choice. As he turned onto the unmarked access road leading to the property, his headlights caught the gleam of fresh tire tracks cutting through the snow. Following them slowly, he spotted a silver sedan, partially hidden behind a stand of pines, its front end crumpled against a tree. The driver's door hung open, snow already accumulating on the seats. No sign of the driver. Harlan radioed in his location and the vehicle's license plate before grabbing his flashlight and service weapon. The bitter wind cut right through his sheriff's jacket as he followed a single set of footprints leading away from the car toward the old farmhouse. They appeared uneven, suggesting the person was injured. The 2-story farmhouse loomed dark against the swirling snow. Most of the windows were boarded up, but Harlan noticed a faint light flickering somewhere on the second floor. The footprints led straight to the front door, which was slightly ajar. "Sheriff's Department," he called out, pushing the door open wider. "Anyone in here? I'm here to help." No response came from inside the darkened house. The air inside felt nearly as cold as outside, carrying a musty odor of decay and something else, something metallic and organic that Harlan instantly recognized from crime scenes. Blood. His flashlight beam revealed dusty floors with clear footprints, not just the fresh ones he'd been following, but multiple sets crisscrossing the entryway. Some appeared to be days old, others fresher. None of this made sense. The property was miles from anywhere, practically inaccessible in this weather. "Hello? Sheriff's Department," he called again, louder this time. The house creaked and settled around him, but otherwise remained silent. Moving carefully through the first floor, Harlan found nothing but empty rooms with peeling wallpaper and scattered debris. The footprints he'd been following led to a staircase, continuing upward. As he approached the stairs, his radio crackled to life, making him jump. "Sheriff, dispatch here. That vehicle is registered to a Daniel Morrow from Billings, reported missing 3 weeks ago by his wife. Over." 3 weeks. The tire tracks outside were fresh, couldn't be more than an hour old. "Copy that," Harlan responded, keeping his voice low. "Send back up to my location. Possible connection to missing person. 10 to 4, but nearest units are at least 40 minutes out in this weather." Harlan knew he shouldn't proceed alone, but the thought of someone injured and freezing to death upstairs overrode protocol. He began climbing the stairs, wincing at each creak of the aged wood beneath his boots. The second-floor hallway stretched into darkness, 4 doorways leading off it. The flickering light he'd spotted from outside came from the last room on the right. As he moved toward it, The metallic smell grew stronger. The door to the lit room stood partially open. Harlan could see the dancing shadows cast by what appeared to be candles. He pushed the door wider with his foot, gun raised. "Sheriff's Department, anyone in here, show yourself now." The room contained nothing but a wooden chair, placed in the center, facing away from the door. Around it, dozens of candles formed a perfect circle, their flames wavering in drafts from the broken window. On the chair sat a police scanner, the same model used by his own department, quietly broadcasting patrol updates. And on the walls, covering nearly every inch of available space, were photographs, hundreds of them. As Harlan stepped closer, his blood turned colder than the February air outside. The photos showed him Robert Harlan on patrol, Robert Harlan at the grocery store, Robert Harlan in his yard, Robert Harlan sleeping through his bedroom window. Interspersed were photos of other people, some he recognized as local residents, others unfamiliar. Many had their faces circled in red. Several of those faces he recognized from missing persons reports that had crossed his desk over the past year. In the center of one wall hung a county map with locations marked in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The Blackwood property was circled multiple times. Before Harlan could process what he was seeing, a floorboard creaked in the hallway behind him. He spun around, but too late. Something heavy struck his arm, sending his gun clattering across the floor. Pain exploded through his shoulder as he stumbled backward. A figure stood in the doorway, face obscured by shadow. Not the injured motorist Harlan had expected to find, but someone larger, moving with purpose. "Been waiting for you, Sheriff," a voice said, familiar somehow, though Harlan couldn't place it. "Thought the weather might keep you away, but you're predictable, always responding personally to calls near your precious hunting cabin." How did this person know about his cabin? Few people knew he owned property just 5 miles from here. The figure stepped forward into the candlelight, revealing a face Harlan hadn't seen in years. Carter Walsh, a former deputy he'd fired for excessive force against suspects. "Walsh, what the hell is this?" "This," Walsh gestured to the photos, "is what happens when you take everything from someone. I've been documenting your life while planning how to end it." The former deputy held a hunting knife that glinted in the candlelight. "Those missing people? They all wronged me in some small way. But you destroyed my life." Harlan lunged for his dropped weapon, but his injured arm slowed him. Walsh was faster, kicking the gun further away before bringing the knife down. Harlan rolled sideways, the blade missing him by inches. What followed was a desperate struggle, a 58-year-old sheriff against a younger, rage-fueled opponent. Walsh slashed wildly, catching Harlan across the chest, but the sheriff managed to grab a heavy candlestick, swinging it hard against Walsh's temple. The former deputy staggered, giving Harlan precious seconds to retrieve his weapon. As Walsh charged again, knife raised, Harlan fired twice. The shots echoed through the empty house as Walsh collapsed. Bleeding and exhausted, Harlan handcuffed the unconscious man before radioing for emergency services. While waiting for backup to arrive, he examined the other walls, finding detailed plans for abductions going back 18 months, and future targets, including Harlan's own family members. The subsequent investigation revealed Walsh had been living periodically in the farmhouse's storm cellar, which contained evidence linking him to 7 disappearances across 3 counties. The silver sedan had been stolen from his latest victim just hours earlier and deliberately crashed to set a trap for Harlan, whose patrol patterns Walsh had studied meticulously. To this day, Sheriff Harlan can't drive past abandoned rural properties without checking his rearview mirror. He no longer responds to calls alone, no matter how routine they seem. And every year, On the anniversary of that night, he visits the families of Walsh's victims, carrying the weight of not having stopped a predator who had once worn the same badge he did. The most terrifying part, Harlan often reflects, isn't that he nearly died that night. It's how long Walsh had watched him, studied him, and planned, all while Harlan remained completely unaware of the danger. And he wonders how many other threats might be out there, watching and waiting, just beyond the beam of his flashlight. The summer of 2002 began like any other for Sheriff Lucas Merritt of Pinewood County, Arizona. 17 years into his career, Merritt had developed a reputation as a steady, methodical lawman who rarely encountered cases that couldn't be resolved through patience and careful police work. At 52, with salt and pepper hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades under the southwestern sun, he was respected throughout the sprawling rural county he'd sworn to protect. July 12th started with routine paperwork and a couple of minor traffic incidents, nothing to suggest it would become the day that would haunt Merritt for the rest of his life. Around 2 p.m., dispatch received a call from a hiker who had stumbled across what appeared to be an abandoned campsite near Hidden Valley, a remote area about 40 miles from the county seat. The hiker reported finding personal belongings scattered around the site, including a wallet with identification, but no sign of the campers. Merritt decided to check it out himself. Hidden Valley was difficult to access, a narrow canyon surrounded by steep mesas, popular with experienced hikers and rock climbers, but rarely visited by casual tourists. The sheriff had been there only twice before, both times for rescue operations involving injured climbers. The drive took nearly an hour along increasingly rugged roads, eventually requiring Merritt to continue the last 3 miles on foot. The summer heat was oppressive, even in the late afternoon, and Merritt was sweating heavily by the time he reached the coordinates provided by the hiker. The campsite was immediately unsettling. A 2-person tent remained standing, but had been partially collapsed on one side. Cooking equipment was arranged neatly beside a fire pit, looking as if the campers had been preparing a meal. A cooler contained food that had spoiled in the heat, suggesting the site had been abandoned for at least several days. Most concerning was the state of the personal belongings. Clothing, hiking boots, and backpacks were scattered in a wide radius around the camp, as if thrown during a struggle or in panic. Merritt found the wallet mentioned by the hiker. It belonged to Dr. Alan Reeves, a geology professor from University of Arizona in Tucson. A second ID found in a purse identified Dr. Catherine Langley, also from the university's geology department. A quick call to dispatch confirmed both were indeed reported missing 3 days earlier, when they failed to return from what was supposed to be a weekend research trip. As Merritt continued his search of the area, he noticed something odd. The ground around the campsite showed numerous footprints, but there was a clear trail of prints leading away from the camp toward the canyon wall. Following them, he found they disappeared abruptly at the base of a seemingly solid rock face. Puzzled, Merritt examined the area more carefully and discovered that what appeared to be part of the natural canyon wall was actually a camouflaged entrance to a cave or tunnel. Someone had constructed a clever door using local rock and materials that blended almost perfectly with the surroundings. Only up close was the seam visible. Protocol dictated waiting for backup, but with 2 people missing and the nearest deputies at least an hour away, Merritt decided to investigate further. He drew his service weapon, switched on his flashlight, and cautiously entered the hidden passage. The tunnel was surprisingly well constructed, about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, with rough-hewn walls that extended deep into the mesa. The air inside was noticeably cooler, and carried a strange chemical odor Merritt couldn't identify. After about 50 yards, the passage opened into a larger chamber that stopped the veteran sheriff in his tracks. The space had been converted into a crude laboratory. Tables were covered with scientific equipment, microscopes, centrifuges, chemical containers, and various instruments Merritt didn't recognize. Computer equipment lined one wall, with monitors displaying geological survey maps and what appeared to be chemical formulas. Most alarmingly, there were restraints attached to 2 examination tables in the center of the room. "Sheriff's Department," Merritt called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Anyone here?" No response came, but a faint sound, something between a moan and a whimper, emanated from deeper in the cave system. Following it, Merritt discovered a second chamber, where he found Dr. Reeves and Dr. Langley. They were alive, but in terrible condition. Both were severely dehydrated, with multiple injection marks on their arms. Langley was semi-conscious, while Reeves appeared delirious, muttering incoherently about breakthrough and changing everything. Neither seemed to have any awareness of Merritt's presence. As he radioed for emergency medical assistance, Merritt heard an engine start outside, a sound that shouldn't have been possible given the remote location. He rushed back through the tunnel to find a dust cloud rising from a previously unnoticed track, leading away from the canyon in the opposite direction from which he had approached. With the victims needing immediate medical attention, Merritt couldn't pursue. Instead, he returned to provide what care he could while waiting for help to arrive. It took the rescue team 3 hours to reach them, and another 4 to evacuate the professors to the nearest hospital. The subsequent investigation revealed a disturbing story. The hidden facility had been operating for at least 2 years, based on journals and records recovered from the computers. A group calling themselves the Pioneers had been conducting unsanctioned experiments related to a unique mineral formation found only in Hidden Valley. Experiments involving chemical compounds with potential military applications. Dr. Reeves and Dr. Langley hadn't stumbled onto the site by accident. Their research had led them to Hidden Valley, specifically to study the unusual geology. The Pioneers had been monitoring academic publications on the subject and intercepted the professors before they could document their findings. Most disturbing were the medical logs, which detailed how the Pioneers had been using the professors as test subjects, administering various compounds derived from the minerals and documenting the effects. The journals described previous subjects as well, raising the possibility that other missing persons cases might be connected. Despite an extensive multi-agency investigation involving the FBI and state police, none of the perpetrators were ever apprehended. The hidden laboratory had been professionally sanitized before Merritt discovered it, leaving few forensic traces. The vehicle tracks led to a state highway where the trail went cold. Dr. Langley eventually recovered enough to provide a partial description of their captors: 3 men and a woman who wore surgical masks during their procedures. She recalled they spoke about national security and necessary sacrifices, but could provide few identifying details. Dr. Reeves never fully recovered. The unknown substances had caused permanent neurological damage, leaving him with tremors, memory loss, and episodes of paranoia. 6 months after his rescue, he took his own life, leaving behind a note that read only, "They're still watching. They'll never stop." For Sheriff Merritt, the case became an obsession. He spent countless off-duty hours searching for connections, following up on similar disappearances across the Southwest. 3 years after the incident, while investigating an abandoned ranch property that he believed might be connected to the Pioneers, Merritt received an anonymous envelope containing a single photograph, a surveillance image of himself and his wife, standing on their front porch. taken just days earlier. The message was clear: stop investigating. With a family to protect, Merritt reluctantly backed off the active investigation, but he never stopped collecting information. After his retirement in 2009, he assembled a comprehensive file on the pioneers and entrusted copies to several journalists and fellow law enforcement officers, with instructions to release the information should anything happen to him. Merritt still lives in Pinewood County, though he's moved twice since the incident. He keeps a loaded shotgun by his bed and has installed extensive security around his home. Every few months, he receives a blank postcard with a simple drawing of a Pioneer wagon, a reminder that someone is still watching. The Hidden Valley facility was destroyed by a mysterious fire in 2004, erasing most of the physical evidence. The case officially remains open, but inactive due to lack of leads. Occasionally, reports surface of similar laboratories discovered in remote locations across the American Southwest, but no definitive connection to the pioneers has been established. To this day, Sheriff Merritt wonders what was really happening in that hidden laboratory and how many other victims might have passed through before the professors were found. But his most troubling question remains unanswered. How high up did the protection for these pioneers go? And what were they really trying to achieve in that remote canyon that was worth the lives they took? When asked about the case now, Merritt shares one piece of advice with young deputies. The badge doesn't protect you from everything. There are some truths people will kill to keep hidden, and some mysteries that are safer left unsolved. On a bitterly cold January night in 1997, Sheriff Dale Erickson of Clearwater County, Minnesota, was nearing the end of his shift. At 48, Erickson was a veteran lawman with over 2 decades of experience patrolling the rural county's 630 square miles, a vast landscape of dense forests, frozen lakes, and scattered farming communities. His midnight patrol usually marked the transition to quieter hours, but this particular night would become infamous in the department's history. The temperature had plunged to minus 28 degrees, with wind chill making it feel closer to minus 40. Most residents were sensibly tucked away in their homes, and Erickson had spent his shift checking on isolated properties and looking for stranded motorists. At 11:42 p.m., he radioed dispatch to report he was completing his final loop along County Road 7, a remote stretch connecting 2 small townships, before heading back to the station. "All clear on 7. Erickson's voice crackled over the radio. "Just passing the old Halverson property. Heading back in 10. The Halverson property was a local landmark, a once prosperous dairy farm, abandoned in the 1980s after the owner's financial troubles led to bankruptcy. The main house stood about 100 yards back from the road, partially visible through a stand of bare oak trees. Something about the property caught Erickson's attention that night, as he added, "Hold on, seeing some lights at the Halverson place. Going to check it out." Dispatch acknowledged his message. "Copy that, Sheriff. Need backup?" "Negative," Erickson replied. "Probably just kids. Won't be long." It was the last routine transmission anyone would hear from Sheriff Dale Erickson. 20 minutes passed with no further communication. Dispatch attempted to reach him several times without success. Following protocol, Deputy Lisa Marquez was dispatched to check on him. She arrived at the Halverson property at 12:17 a.m. to find Erickson's patrol vehicle parked near the house, engine still running, driver's door open. His flashlight lay in the snow nearby, still illuminated. Of the sheriff himself, there was no sign. Marquez immediately called for backup. Within the hour, every available officer in the county had converged on the scene. The house and outbuildings were searched thoroughly, yielding nothing except for a single set of footprints leading from Ericsson's vehicle toward the main house, before suddenly stopping about halfway there, as if he had vanished mid-stride. The snow covering the property was pristine and undisturbed beyond Ericsson's own tracks. There were no tire marks besides those from his vehicle and later Marquez's, no evidence of other footprints, no signs of struggle. His service weapon remained holstered, unfired. The only unusual detail was his radio, found 20 feet from where his footprints ended, partially buried in snow. By dawn, the search had expanded to include state police, search dogs, and volunteers from neighboring counties. Helicopters with thermal imaging technology scanned the area once daylight broke. Days turned into weeks as the search continued, expanding to cover miles of surrounding wilderness. Sheriff Dale Erickson had simply vanished without a trace. The investigation explored every possibility. Given the extreme cold, one theory held that Erickson had somehow become disoriented due to hypothermia, wandered off, and succumbed to the elements. But the dogs never picked up his scent beyond where his footprints ended, and extensive ground searches found nothing to support this theory. Another line of inquiry focused on whether Erickson might have had enemies, perhaps someone he'd arrested seeking revenge. His case files were thoroughly reviewed, and numerous interviews conducted with individuals who might harbor grudges. Nothing substantive emerged. The case took a bizarre turn 3 weeks after Erickson's disappearance, when dispatch received a radio transmission on the department's frequency at exactly 11:42 p.m., precisely the time of Erickson's last routine call. The voice was distorted and barely intelligible, but audio analysts later confirmed it contained what sounded like Erickson saying, "Not alone here," something in the, before dissolving into static. The transmission was triangulated to have originated from the vicinity of the Halverson property, but when officers rushed to the scene, they found it undisturbed, exactly as it had been since that January night. The radio recovered from the snow weeks earlier remained in evidence lockup. 6 months after the disappearance, a development breathed new life into the investigation. A teenage couple trespassing at the Halverson property to explore the abandoned buildings discovered Erickson's badge partially embedded in the concrete floor of the house's root cellar, a small underground storage space traditionally used for preserving vegetables. The concrete appeared freshly poured around the badge. Investigators immediately excavated the entire cellar floor, expecting the worst. What they found beneath the concrete raised more questions than answers. There was no body, but rather a natural cavity in the earth, what appeared to be an entrance to a small cave system, not documented in any county geological survey. The passage descended sharply before becoming too narrow for adult exploration after about 30 feet. Specialized cave rescue teams were brought in to map the system. They discovered the passage eventually connected to a larger underground network that extended for miles beneath the county, a network that geologists confirmed shouldn't exist, given the region's limestone-poor bedrock. Most disturbing was what the teams found approximately 300 feet into the system. Sheriff Erickson's service revolver, his department-issued flashlight, different from the one found in the snow, and a handheld digital recorder. The items were arranged in a neat triangle on a flat rock surface, as if deliberately placed there. The recorder's battery had long died, but when technicians managed to extract the data, they recovered a single audio file timestamped 11:53 p.m. on the night of Erickson's disappearance, 11 minutes after his last radio contact. The recording begins with heavy breathing and what sounds like movement through confined spaces. Erickson's voice, unusually tense, narrates, "Following tunnel under Halverson Place. Heard sounds coming from root cellar. Floor was already open when I arrived. Never knew this was down here." After about 2 minutes of movement sounds, Erickson whispers, "Something's not right. Air feels wrong. Smells like copper and something else, like ozone after lightning." Another minute passes, with just the sound of cautious footsteps and occasional heavy breathing, before Erickson speaks again, his voice now urgent. "Jesus Christ, there's light ahead. Blue light. It's pulsing, and there's something moving around it. Several somethings. Not human, not animal either. I'm going to try to..." The recording captures a sudden rush of air, like a strong wind in a confined space, followed by a sound analysts have been unable to identify, described variously as mechanical humming combined with something organic, and like multiple voices speaking backward simultaneously. Erickson's final words on the recording come through clearly, despite his obvious terror. "They've seen me. God help me, they're coming this way. If anyone finds this, don't come down here. Seal it up. Whatever's down here has been here a long time, and it needs to stay buried." The recording ends with the sound of Erickson apparently running, followed by a scream that audio experts have determined was cut short not by the recorder being damaged or turned off, but by the sound itself ceasing unnaturally mid-vocalization. County authorities made the controversial decision to seal the cave system, pouring hundreds of gallons of concrete into the entrance discovered beneath the Halverson property. The official explanation cited dangerous structural instability, though internal documents later obtained through Freedom of Information requests referred to unexplained biological contaminants found in soil samples from the cave. Strangest of all was the fate of the recording itself. 3 separate copies were made by the investigation team, but within weeks, all had degraded into unrecoverable static. The original likewise became corrupted while in evidence storage. No usable version of Sheriff Erickson's final moments remains in existence. Dale Erickson was officially declared dead in 2004, 7 years after his disappearance. The case remains technically open, but inactive. His widow still lives in Clearwater County and has never remarried. The Halverson property was purchased by the county in 1998 and the buildings demolished. The land remains undeveloped, surrounded by chain-link fencing and posted with "No trespassing" signs. Once a year, on the anniversary of Erickson's disappearance, his former deputies, many now retired, hold a small memorial service at the site. Perhaps the most unsettling postscript to the story came in 2015, when scientists from the University of Minnesota, conducting geological surveys in the county, recorded unexplained seismic anomalies centered exactly beneath the former Halverson property, rhythmic vibrations occurring precisely every 28 days that one researcher described as almost like something down there is breathing. County maps now mark the area with a simple designation: restricted access, environmental hazard. Locals have a different name for it. They call it Erickson's Hole, and even the most skeptical residents of Clearwater County make a point of driving miles out of their way to avoid passing the property after dark. The true nature of what Sheriff Dale Erickson encountered beneath the Halverson farm remains unknown. What is certain is that something in those unknown depths took a good man from his family and community, leaving behind only fragmentary evidence of horrors that perhaps we're fortunate not to fully understand. In the late autumn of 2009, Sheriff Thomas Keller of Red Pine County, Wisconsin, was approaching his 4th year in office with a solid record of public service. At 41, Keller was respected in the rural community of just over 17,000 residents spread across dense forest land and small farming communities. He'd grown up there, left for the Army, served as a military police officer, then returned home to join the sheriff's department. While not without its challenges, occasional drug problems, domestic disturbances, and the usual rural crimes, Red Pine County was generally considered a peaceful place to live. That perception changed forever on October 12, 2009, when the first letter arrived. It was a Monday morning when Keller found the envelope among routine paperwork on his desk. Nothing about it seemed unusual at first. Plain white business envelope, his name and title typed on the front, no return address. He assumed it was from a local resident, perhaps with a complaint or suggestion too sensitive to share in person. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Sheriff Keller, I know what happened to Miranda Collins. I saw everything. Check the old processing plant at the north end of Ridge Road. Storage room B, behind the broken compressor. You won't find Miranda, but you'll find proof. I can't come forward. He knows who I am. A concerned citizen. The message immediately seized Keller's attention. Miranda Collins was a 19-year-old college student who had disappeared 3 years earlier while home visiting family for Thanksgiving break. Despite extensive searches and a thorough investigation, no trace of her had ever been found. The case had gone cold after months without leads, becoming one of the county's few unsolved serious crimes. Keller immediately assembled a small team, sworn to secrecy about the letter's contents. The abandoned meat processing plant had been searched during the initial investigation, but yielded nothing. It had closed in 2001 and stood empty since, a decaying industrial relic on the outskirts of town. The search team entered the dilapidated building that afternoon, navigating halls strewn with debris and weather damage. Storage room B was difficult to locate. Part of the building's layout had changed from the original blueprints they'd referenced. When they finally found it, the broken compressor mentioned in the letter was there, a massive piece of rusted machinery against the far wall. Behind it, they discovered what the letter writer had promised: evidence. The wall paneling had been removed and replaced, noticeable only when examined closely. When removed, it revealed a small cavity containing a plastic bag. Inside were Miranda Collins's driver's license, a silver bracelet her family had confirmed she was wearing when she disappeared, and a man's wristwatch with an inscription reading, "To Robert, with pride, Dad, 1997. The watch was quickly connected to Robert Tillman, a 44-year-old mechanic who had lived in Red Pine County all his life. Tillman had been briefly questioned during the original investigation. He'd done some maintenance work at the Collins family home the month before Miranda disappeared, but nothing had linked him to the crime. Armed with this new evidence, Keller obtained warrants for Tillman's home and workplace. The search yielded nothing conclusive until a forensics team discovered microscopic blood traces in the trunk of an old car Tillman kept behind his garage, scheduled for restoration. DNA analysis later confirmed it was Miranda's blood. Robert Tillman was arrested on October 17, 2009, but maintained his innocence, claiming the evidence had been planted. His lawyer pointed out the obvious question: if Tillman was guilty, who had written the anonymous letter, and how did they know where evidence had been hidden? The investigation took an even stranger turn when a second letter arrived at Keller's office, exactly 1 week after the first. This one contained only a cryptic message. Good work, Sheriff. 1 found, 3 to go. Whitford Park, the old well. You have until Friday. The letter triggered immediate alarm. What 3 to go could only mean was unthinkable: that there were other victims besides Miranda Collins. The reference to Whitford Park was clear. It was a large wooded area at the edge of town, with hiking trails and picnic areas. But there was no well marked on any park maps. Keller organized search teams to comb the park, bringing in cadaver dogs from neighboring counties. On the second day of searching, they discovered an old stone well, hidden by decades of overgrowth in a remote corner of the park. It had been covered with plywood and concealed by brush and fallen leaves. When the search team removed the cover, they made a horrifying discovery. At the bottom of the dry well shaft, about 15 feet down, lay human remains. Forensic examination would later identify them as belonging to Eliza Watterson, a 22-year-old who had disappeared in 2001 while jogging near the park. Her case had been treated as a likely runaway at the time, based on some personal problems and a note found in her apartment that suggested she was planning to leave town. A third letter arrived before the identification was even complete. "Two down, Sheriff. Your county has forgotten too many. The logging road off Highway 16, mile marker 34. The clearing with the lightning-struck pine. 6 feet down. You won't believe who put her there. Clock's ticking." This time, Keller called in state investigators. The letter writer was revealing crimes that had gone completely undetected. People who hadn't even been reported missing, or whose disappearances had been attributed to other causes. As they prepared to search the logging road location, Keller noticed something disturbing. The letters were being placed directly on his desk, not coming through mail. Someone with access to the sheriff's department was delivering them. The search at the logging road location yielded another set of remains, these much older. They would eventually be identified as Carol Masterson, a bank teller who had supposedly moved away in 1998 after leaving a resignation letter at her workplace. Her family had received postcards from various locations around the country for almost a year after her supposed departure, postcards that investigators now determined had been written by someone else. Keller ordered a review of all missing persons and suspicious departure cases from the past 15 years, while implementing strict security measures within the department. Security cameras were installed covering his office door and all station entrances. The fourth letter somehow appeared on his desk despite these precautions. "Last one, Sheriff. She's the one that started it all. Harrison Quarry, North Face, behind the fallen rocks. I've given you justice for 4 forgotten souls. Now you need to look at your own department. The monster wore a badge." The message sent shockwaves through the investigation. Harrison Quarry was an abandoned granite quarry that had closed in the 1970s. The site yielded the remains of Patricia Donahue, who had disappeared in 1997 at age 20. She had been classified as a runaway due to a history of conflicts with her parents, though they had always maintained she wouldn't have left without contacting them. The investigation now turned inward. The reference to someone wearing a badge could only mean law enforcement, possibly someone still working in the department. Keller brought in state investigators to handle the internal investigation, removing himself from direct involvement to avoid any conflict of interest. Security footage showed no one entering Keller's office during the times the letters could have been delivered. Whoever was placing them knew the blind spots in the building's layout and security systems. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Forensic analysis of soil samples from Patricia Donahue's remains contained microscopic particles of a specialized boot polish used primarily by military and police. This same polish was found in soil samples from the other 3 crime scenes as well, suggesting the same person had been present at all 4 locations. Records showed only one officer who had been with the department during all 4 disappearances: former Sheriff William Garrett, who had retired in 2005 after 27 years with the department. Garrett had been Keller's mentor and the person who had encouraged him to run for sheriff after his retirement. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling enough for a search warrant for Garrett's rural property. There, investigators found a locked workshop where forensic teams discovered hair and fiber evidence connecting him to at least 2 of the victims. Most damning was a collection of personal items in a hidden floor safe. Apparent trophies, including Miranda Collins' student ID card and Carol Masterson's house key. William Garrett was arrested on November 9, 2009. The 67-year-old former sheriff showed no emotion as his successor placed him in handcuffs. When questioned about his motive, he reportedly said only, "This county needed a protector. Sometimes protection means removing threats." Investigation into Garrett's history revealed disturbing patterns. All 4 victims had filed police reports shortly before their disappearances. Complaints ranging from stalking to assault that Garrett had personally handled and subsequently dismissed or buried in paperwork. The working theory became that he had targeted women he perceived as troublemakers or morally compromised, appointing himself judge and executioner while using his position to cover up the crimes. The case seemed closed, but one question remained unanswered. Who had written the letters that exposed these crimes? The anonymous tipster had never come forward, despite the case's high profile. Forensic analysis of the letters revealed nothing. No fingerprints, DNA, or identifiable typewriter or printer characteristics. 3 months after Garrett's arrest, a 5th and final letter arrived at Sheriff Keller's home address rather than his office. Sheriff Keller, justice has been served. William Garrett took my daughter Patricia in 1997. I suspected him from the beginning, but no one would listen to a grieving mother's intuition about a respected sheriff. I spent years gathering evidence, following him, learning his secrets. I couldn't bring my daughter back, but I could ensure he paid for what he did, to her and to the others. I won't trouble you again. My work is finished. Margaret Donahue. Margaret Donahue, Patricia's mother, had died of cancer in 2007, 2 years before the first letter arrived. Investigators located her personal effects in storage at her sister's home and found journals detailing her suspicions and investigation of Garrett. The journals ended in 2006 with a final entry. "I've found them all. 4 lives he took. I know where they are. But my time is running out. The cancer is spreading. I need to find another way to make sure they're found." Handwriting analysis confirmed the journals were genuinely Margaret's, but experts determined the letters sent to Sheriff Keller were written by someone else, though they contained information only available in Margaret's journals. Her sister admitted that before her death, Margaret had entrusted a sealed package to someone who could finish what I started, but refused to name this person. To this day, the identity of the letter writer remains unknown. Theories range from a department insider who discovered Margaret's evidence to one of Margaret's friends carrying out her final wishes. Some even speculate that multiple people were involved, explaining how the letters could appear in secured areas without detection. William Garrett was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder in 2011 and sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. He died in prison in 2017, never having revealed any details about his crimes beyond what investigators had uncovered. For Sheriff Thomas Keller, the case permanently changed his approach to law enforcement. He implemented numerous reforms in the department, including mandatory reviews of all cases involving vulnerable individuals and strict chain of custody procedures for evidence. He was re-elected 3 times before retiring in 2021. The Red Pine County case stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest threats lurk behind the very badges meant to protect us, and that justice, even when delayed by decades, can come from the most unexpected sources. Sheriff Marcus Weldon had seen his fair share of strange occurrences during his 15 years with the Summit County Sheriff's Department in Colorado. The rugged mountain terrain, Extreme weather conditions and isolated communities created unique challenges for law enforcement. But nothing in his experience prepared him for what began on a stormy night in June 2013, a case that would remain officially unsolved, yet haunt him for the rest of his career. The trouble started with a routine service call. A severe thunderstorm had knocked out power to much of the county, including the small town of Pine Haven, nestled in a remote valley. While checking on elderly residents, Sheriff Weldon received a peculiar call over his radio. "Sheriff, you need to get to the old fire tower on Black Ridge Peak. Someone's broadcasting from up there." The voice belonged to Nancy Carter, the night dispatcher. "Broadcasting what?" Weldon asked, wiping rain from his face as he returned to his vehicle. "That's just it. I don't know," Nancy replied. "We're picking up some kind of signal interfering with our radio frequency. Sounds like a voice, but it's distorted. The radio technician says it's coming from the direction of the tower." The abandoned fire tower had been decommissioned in 2001 when newer satellite monitoring systems made it obsolete. Sitting atop Black Ridge Peak at 10,000 feet elevation, it was accessible only via a treacherous Forest Service road, difficult in good weather, potentially deadly during a storm. "Nancy, it's probably just interference from the storm. I'll check it tomorrow when—" "Sheriff," Nancy interrupted, her voice tense. "The signal's getting stronger, and it sounds like someone calling for help." Weldon hesitated. Protocol said to wait for better conditions, but if someone was stranded at the tower in this weather, they might not survive the night. He made the decision. "I'm heading there now. Alert search and rescue to stand by, but don't send them up in this weather unless I call for backup." The journey to Black Ridge Peak was as treacherous as Weldon anticipated. Twice his SUV nearly slid off the muddy road, and fallen branches forced him to stop and clear a path. The rain was relentless, reducing visibility to mere feet. His radio crackled with static the higher he climbed. An hour later, soaked despite his rain gear, Weldon arrived at the base of the tower. No vehicles were visible, no signs that anyone had been there recently. The tower itself loomed above, a skeletal structure of weathered metal disappearing into the low clouds. "Nancy, I'm at the tower," he radioed. "No sign of anyone. Are you still picking up that signal?" Static was his only reply, but he thought he heard something else beneath it. A voice, faint and distorted. Weldon retrieved his flashlight and service weapon before approaching the tower. The metal staircase spiraling up the structure groaned under his weight, decades of exposure having weakened its integrity. As he climbed higher, the static on his radio intensified, but now he was certain he could make out words forming beneath the noise. A man's voice, desperate and afraid. The observation cabin at the top of the tower was a small hexagonal room with windows on all sides. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. Weldon pushed it open, sweeping his flashlight across the interior. The room was empty, except for an ancient chair and desk. Atop the desk sat an old radio transmitter, a model that hadn't been used by Forest Services since the 1980s. Its power light glowed green, despite the general power outage, and its dials moved slightly, as if being adjusted by invisible hands. "This is Sheriff Marcus Weldon," he announced to the empty room. "Is anyone here?" The radio on the desk suddenly hissed to life, causing him to flinch. Through a wash of static, he heard a voice, clear enough now to understand. "Mayday, mayday. This is Fire Watcher Davis Colton. Tower's been struck. Fire spreading through the forest below. Can anyone hear me? Over." Weldon stared at the radio in confusion. There was no fire. And Davis Colton? The name sounded vaguely familiar. He lifted his own radio. "Nancy, are you receiving? I need you to look up a name. Davis Colton, former fire watcher." Only static replied. But the desk radio spoke again. The fires surrounding the tower. I'm trapped. Temperatures rising. If anyone can hear this, send help to Blackridge Tower immediately. A cold realization washed over Weldon. He remembered the name now. Davis Colton was the last fire watcher assigned to this tower, who had died in 1976 when lightning struck the structure during a severe storm, igniting a forest fire that trapped him inside. The official report stated that his last radio transmissions described his desperate situation as the fire engulfed the tower base. But that was 37 years ago. Weldon's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the radio's power switch. Before he could touch it, the device emitted a high-pitched squeal that forced him to cover his ears. When it subsided, the voice had changed. It was now addressing him directly. Sheriff Weldon, finally someone hears me. I've been broadcasting for so long. The hair on Weldon's neck stood on end. How do you know my name? I see everyone who comes up here, the voice replied, but they never stay long enough to hear me. The frequency only aligns during storms, when conditions match the night I died. Weldon backed toward the door, his training warring with the impossibility of what was happening. What do you want? Justice, the voice whispered, now seeming to come from all around, rather than just the radio. It wasn't an accident. The fire wasn't from lightning. The windows began to fog, not with condensation, but with what appeared to be smoke. The temperature in the small room rose noticeably. I was murdered, the voice continued. They wanted the fire to destroy the evidence. Check the South Ridge slope, the old survey marker. Dig there. Suddenly, the radio sparked and went silent. The smoke-like fog dissipated, and the temperature returned to normal. Weldon stood frozen for several minutes before finally gathering himself and descending the tower in the now subsiding rain. Back at the department, records confirmed Davis Colton had indeed died in a fire at the tower in 1976. The official cause was a lightning strike, though the report noted the radio somehow continued functioning long enough for dispatchers to record Colton's final moments. Those recordings had been sealed as part of the investigation and subsequently lost during a department relocation in the 1990s. Against all logic and protocol, Weldon returned to Blackridge 3 days later with ground-penetrating radar equipment borrowed from a geologist friend. At the South Ridge survey marker, they discovered an anomaly 3 feet below the surface. Excavation revealed a metal box containing a journal and a damaged audio recorder, both belonging to Davis Colton. The journal's final entries detailed Colton's discovery of illegal logging operations in protected areas of the forest, operations apparently sanctioned by county officials at the time. The last entry, dated the day of his death, mentioned gathering photographic evidence and a planned meeting with federal authorities. Forensic analysis of Colton's remains, exhumed for re-examination, found evidence inconsistent with the original fire death determination. Trace amounts of an accelerant were detected on bone fragments, and fractures to the skull suggested trauma prior to the fire. The case was officially reopened, but quickly stalled. All suspects, the county commissioner, Forest Service supervisor, and sheriff from that era, were long deceased. The statute of limitations on most associated crimes had expired, though murder had none. The investigation file remains open, but inactive, listed as unresolved rather than closed. Sheriff Weldon never returned to the tower after recovering the evidence. He filed his report detailing the radio phenomenon, but omitted his conversation with what appeared to be Colton's voice, citing just an anonymous tip leading to the discovery at the survey marker. Unexplained radio interference continues to affect emergency frequencies in Summit County during severe thunderstorms, particularly near Black Ridge Peak. Maintenance crews sent to check the tower repeatedly report finding the long obsolete radio transmitter, despite multiple removals. Each time, it sits on the desk, dusty and unpowered, yet somehow untouched by decades of exposure to the elements. Sheriff Weldon retired in 2019, but locals say he still monitors an old emergency band radio during storms, sometimes until dawn, listening carefully through the static for voices from the forgotten frequency. In August of 2016, Sheriff Elena Vasquez of Sagebrush County, New Mexico, found herself at the center of a case that would challenge not only her investigative skills, but also her understanding of human psychology and the dark corners of rural isolation. 43 years old and 6 years into her tenure as sheriff, Vasquez had built a reputation for level-headed persistence in a county spanning 3,200 square miles of arid landscape, punctuated by small communities and vast, empty spaces. The case began with a 911 call from a panicked tourist who had been hiking near the dried riverbed of the Piedra Arroyo, a seasonal waterway that ran through the western part of the county. The hiker reported finding what appeared to be human remains, partially buried in the cracked mud of the arroyo bed. Deputy Mark Sandoval responded first, confirming the grim discovery before calling in Sheriff Vasquez. When Vasquez arrived at the scene, she found something stranger than she had anticipated. The remains weren't recent. They appeared to be at least several years old, possibly longer. More puzzling was how they were arranged. The bones had been meticulously positioned to form a perfect circle, with the skull placed precisely in the center, facing skyward. In 20 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like it, Vasquez would later tell investigators. Someone had taken great care with the placement. It wasn't random or the result of animal activity. It was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Forensics experts determined the remains belonged to a man in his 30s who had died approximately 5 to 7 years earlier. Cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the back of the head, execution style. The absence of the victim's hands complicated identification efforts, as they had apparently been removed post-mortem. The investigation might have stalled there, another unsolved cold case in a remote area, had it not been for what happened 2 weeks later. A second set of remains was discovered in nearly identical circumstances, arranged in a perfect circle in another section of the dried arroyo, roughly 8 miles downstream from the first site. These remains were older, estimated at 8 to 10 years, but with the same execution-style gunshot wound and missing hands. The discoveries sent a chill through the sparsely populated county. Speculation ran rampant about serial killers and cult activity. Media from Albuquerque and even national outlets began arriving, putting pressure on Vasquez and her small department of 11 deputies. Working with the state police and FBI, Vasquez established a task force dedicated to what was now being called the Arroyo Circle Killer case. Forensic anthropologists helped create facial reconstructions of both victims, which were distributed throughout the region. The first victim was eventually identified as Miguel Hernandez, a seasonal farm worker who had been reported missing in 2010. The second victim remained unidentified. Then came the breakthrough that would give the case its truly bizarre dimension. A retired geologist named Thomas Reese contacted the sheriff's office after seeing the facial reconstruction of the second victim on the news. He believed the man might have been an amateur prospector he had encountered in the county years earlier. More significantly, Reese provided photographs he had taken of unusual rock formations near where both bodies had been discovered. The photographs showed that each body had been placed at locations where the arroyo widened into shallow pools during the rainy season. More specifically, When these pools filled with water, their shapes, from an aerial perspective, formed near-perfect circles against the surrounding landscape. The killer wasn't creating the circles with the bones, Vasquez realized. He was matching patterns already present in the landscape, patterns only visible from above, or when the arroyo filled with water during flash floods. This insight led investigators to examine satellite imagery of the entire arroyo system. They identified 5 additional locations where similar circular patterns formed during seasonal flooding. 3 of these locations had already been searched without finding remains. The 4th site, however, yielded another grim discovery: a 3rd victim, arranged in the familiar circular pattern. This 3rd victim would prove critical to the investigation. The remains were more recent, dating to approximately 3 years earlier, and enough tissue remained for DNA extraction. The sample matched evidence from an unsolved assault case from 2013, involving a geology graduate student named Daniel Covington, who had been conducting field research in the area before disappearing. Covington's research notes, recovered from his abandoned field camp, contained detailed observations of the arroyo's unusual circular formations and their potential geological significance. More disturbingly, his journal entries mentioned encounters with a local resident, a former surveyor, who had shown unusual interest in Covington's research, particularly his aerial photography equipment. This led Vasquez to Leonard Merrick, a 72-year-old former Bureau of Land Management surveyor who lived in an isolated compound near the arroyo. Merrick had worked mapping the region for nearly 3 decades before retiring in 2005. Initial interviews revealed nothing suspicious, though Vasquez noted Merrick's extensive knowledge of the arroyo's topography and his collection of aerial maps dating back to the 1970s. The investigation appeared to be at another impasse until Sheriff Vasquez made a connection that had eluded others. During a sleepless night reviewing case files, she noticed that all 3 victims had been discovered after particularly heavy rainfall, when the arroyo's circular pools would have been briefly filled with water. Furthermore, each body had been positioned so that when the waters receded, the remains would be the last element to emerge from the drying mud, creating a brief period when, viewed from above, a perfect circle of water would surround the centrally placed skull. Armed with this insight and a mounting body of circumstantial evidence, Vasquez obtained a warrant to search Merrick's property thoroughly. In a locked storage shed, investigators discovered thousands of photographs, decades of aerial documentation showing the arroyo's changing patterns through seasonal flooding. Interspersed were disturbing images, capturing the circular pools with what appeared to be human heads at their centers. Photographs taken from a small drone Merrick had modified for extended flight capabilities. The most damning evidence came from a hidden room beneath Merrick's workshop, where they found the missing hands of all 3 victims, preserved in formaldehyde. Each set of hands had been arranged in various poses and meticulously photographed against topographical maps of the region. When confronted with this evidence, Merrick's composure finally broke. His confession, recorded over a 14-hour interview, revealed a disturbed mind, obsessed with patterns and connections between landscape and human anatomy. "You see it, don't you?" he asked Vasquez during the interview. "How the arroyo mirrors the human form from above, the circular pools like joints in a skeleton. I didn't create anything new. I completed what was already there." Merrick had spent decades mapping and remapping the region, developing what psychiatrists would later diagnose as a delusional belief system centered around the landscape having conscious properties. He claimed the circular formations spoke to him, demanding completions through human sacrifice. His selection of victims followed a twisted logic. People who had shown interest in the arroyo's formations, hikers, prospectors, researchers, were, in his mind, already chosen by the landscape. He would observe them for days, sometimes weeks, before approaching them with offers to show them hidden aspects of the terrain. Once isolated, he would execute them, remove their hands, which he saw as tools of measurement that belonged to the land, and place their bodies at precise coordinates he had calculated based on his surveys. The arroyo's seasonal flooding was central to his ritual. He timed the placements so that when water briefly filled the circular formations, he could photograph the scene from above, capturing the moment when his offerings created what he called perfect resonance between man and earth. Leonard Merrick was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. During his trial, psychiatric evaluations revealed a severe delusional disorder that had gone untreated for decades, likely exacerbated by extreme isolation. Nevertheless, he was found competent to stand trial and ultimately convicted on all counts, receiving 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. For Sheriff Vasquez, the case left an indelible mark. "What haunts me isn't just the calculated brutality," she later wrote in a presentation for a law enforcement conference. "It's how someone could live among us for decades, seeing a completely different reality, a reality where murder became an act of devotion to the land itself." The case received renewed attention in 2021 when hikers discovered a 4th arrangement of bones in yet another circular formation of the arroyo, remains later determined to date from the 1990s, well within Merrick's active period. Forensic analysis confirmed his methodology, though Merrick, now in declining health, refused to confirm any additional victims beyond the 3 he had confessed to. Sheriff Vasquez continues to serve Sagebrush County, though she admits she now sees the landscape differently. "I used to find beauty in the vastness," she told a documentary crew filming about the case. "Now I'm always looking for patterns, things hidden in plain sight that might reveal darkness beneath." During significant rainfall, she still personally visits the circular formations along the Piedra Arroyo, ensuring they contain nothing but flowing water and the reflections of clouds passing overhead. In March of 2011, Sheriff Dwayne Fletcher of Lakewood County, Oregon, faced the most perplexing investigation of his 22-year career. At 54, Fletcher was a methodical investigator who had worked his way up through the ranks, earning respect for his thoroughness and calm demeanor, even in the most challenging circumstances. Lakewood County encompassed 1,800 square miles of diverse terrain, from dense forests to high desert, with Echo Lake as its geographical center, a 400-acre natural lake surrounded by vacation cabins and permanent residences. The case began with what appeared to be a tragic accident. Martin Walsh, a 38-year-old electrical engineer and weekend resident at Echo Lake, was found dead in his workshop, electrocuted while working on a custom radio setup. The initial investigation suggested a straightforward accident, until Deputy Sarah Chen, reviewing Walsh's personal effects, discovered a journal containing disturbing entries. "It's happening again," the final entry read, dated the day before Walsh's death. "Third night in a row. Voice coming through even when the equipment is unplugged. Same message. 40 years buried isn't enough. I'm going to try a different frequency range tonight. Whatever's out there wants to be heard." The journal detailed Walsh's 3-month experiment with what he called ambient frequency detection, essentially an attempt to pick up and record naturally occurring radio waves around Echo Lake. His notes described capturing what he initially believed were fragments of commercial radio broadcasts bouncing off the ionosphere, a common phenomenon among radio enthusiasts. But the fragments had grown more coherent over time, eventually forming what Walsh described as a single voice, male, elderly, speaking directly to me. Sheriff Fletcher might have dismissed this as the imaginings of an eccentric hobbyist had it not been for two critical details. First, the medical examiner's report indicated inconsistencies with accidental electrocution. The pattern of electrical burns suggested Walsh had been restrained before the current was applied. Second, Walsh's equipment showed signs of tampering that wouldn't have resulted from a simple malfunction. What began as an accident investigation shifted to a potential homicide. Fletcher ordered a thorough background check on Walsh and a canvass of neighboring properties. The background check revealed nothing suspicious. Walsh was a respected engineer at a tech company in Portland who commuted to his lake house on weekends. The neighbor canvass, however, yielded an unexpected connection. 82-year-old Helen Maddox, who had lived on Echo Lake since the 1960s, mentioned that Walsh had visited her several times in the months before his death, asking about the incident with the radio tower. According to Maddox, Walsh had become interested in a story from 1971, when a small radio tower constructed by the U.S. Geological Survey on the north shore of Echo Lake had been abandoned under mysterious circumstances after only 3 months of operation. The government men packed up overnight, Maddox told Fletcher, left most of their equipment behind. There were rumors about what they heard through that tower. Nobody local would go near it afterward, and the Forest Service finally demolished what remained in '82. Fletcher's research into county records confirmed the USGS had indeed established a monitoring station at Echo Lake in January 1971, officially to study subsurface electromagnetic anomalies. The project was abruptly terminated in April of the same year, with minimal documentation explaining the closure. Most curious was a classified addendum that Fletcher, even with his law enforcement credentials, could not access. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Fletcher obtained Walsh's recorded audio files. Most contained nothing but static and ambient noise, but the final recordings, made in the week before his death, captured what Fletcher described in his report as a voice unlike any I've heard, distorted but clearly human, repeating the same phrase, 40 years buried isn't enough. Audio specialists confirmed the recordings hadn't been doctored or spliced together. Whatever Walsh had captured, it was a genuine transmission, though from what source remained unclear. The phrase 40 years buried caught Fletcher's attention. Counting back from 2011 led to 1971, the same year the USGS station was mysteriously abandoned. Fletcher began searching for any incidents around Echo Lake from that period. County archives revealed a series of disappearances in early 1971. 3 men who had gone missing in separate incidents within a mile of the lake. The cases had never been solved, though investigators at the time had focused on the possibility of a drifter passing through the area. Most notably, the lead investigator on those cases, Deputy Leonard Harris, had resigned from the department shortly afterward, citing health concerns. Fletcher tracked down Harris's widow, who still lived in the county. Now in her 80s, June Harris revealed that her husband had never spoken much about the disappearances. But his health issues, which she described as night terrors and paranoia, had begun immediately after working that case. He would wake up screaming about voices coming from the water, she told Fletcher. Before he died in '93, he made me promise never to go near Echo Lake. Said there was something unnatural there, something that used the water to amplify itself. These details painted a disturbing picture. 4 decades earlier, 3 men had vanished near a lake where a government research station was suddenly abandoned, and now a man investigating strange radio phenomena in the same location had died under suspicious circumstances. Fletcher's next step was to review the geographic locations involved. He discovered that Walsh's cabin was built on the exact site where the USGS radio tower had stood in 1971. More significantly, using modern mapping software, he determined that Walsh's workshop sat directly above a natural underground cavity, essentially a cave system partially filled with water that connected to Echo Lake through subterranean channels. Hydrogeologists confirmed that such a cavity could potentially act as a natural amplifier for certain frequencies generated by moving water. In essence, the unique geology beneath Walsh's property created what one expert described as a natural speaker system with the lake as its diaphragm. This scientific explanation provided context for the phenomena Walsh had recorded, but it did nothing to identify who might have wanted him dead for investigating it. Fletcher focused on finding connections between Walsh and the decades-old disappearances. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A routine evidence review revealed that Walsh's journal contained several pages where he had pressed hard enough with his pen to leave impressions on underlying pages. Digital enhancement of these impressions revealed an address Fletcher hadn't previously connected to the case, belonging to James Carlson, a retired Forest Service employee who had been part of the team that demolished the abandoned radio tower in 1982. Fletcher interviewed Carlson, now 76, at his home 50 miles from Echo Lake. Initially evasive, Carlson eventually admitted that the demolition team had discovered human remains concealed within the tower's concrete foundation. There were 3 of them, Carlson confessed, adult males. The foundation had been poured around them. They were just embedded there. We were told by our supervisor to ignore it, rebury everything, and never mention it. Said it was a matter of national security. Carlson revealed that several workers had taken photographs before following orders to rebury the remains. He still had copies, which he provided to Fletcher. The disturbing images showed partial skeletal remains, exactly as described. 3 adult males who had apparently been placed in the wet concrete of the tower foundation while still alive, as evidenced by signs of struggling visible in the hardened material. Fletcher now had a clear connection to the 3 missing men from 1971, but still no explanation for Walsh's death 40 years later. That final piece came together when Fletcher re-interviewed Walsh's colleagues from Portland. One co-worker revealed that Walsh had been working on technology to improve underground communication, specifically a system that could transmit voice data through solid rock using extremely low frequencies. The prototype, which Walsh had been testing at his Echo Lake workshop, was missing from the crime scene. The investigation ultimately led to Dr. Stephen Merritt, a geophysicist who had been part of the original USGS team in 1971 and was still working for the government. When confronted with the evidence, Merritt broke down, admitting his involvement in both the historical crimes and Walsh's murder. According to Merritt's confession, the 1971 USGS mission had never been about studying electromagnetic anomalies. It was a classified project to develop technology that could detect submarine communications through natural bodies of water, an important Cold War advantage. The 3 men who disappeared had been local residents who had stumbled upon the classified operation while hiking. It was a different time, Merritt claimed. We had orders to protect the project at all costs. Things escalated. We couldn't risk exposure. The project was terminated when the team discovered that their equipment was not just receiving signals, but somehow amplifying and distorting them through Echo Lake's unusual geology. They began picking up what Merritt described as voices that shouldn't have been there, which he attributed to psychological stress, but which terrified the team enough to abandon the site. When Walsh began experimenting with similar technology 4 decades later, his recordings eventually reached frequencies that, according to Merritt, stirred something that should have stayed quiet. Whether Merritt truly believed some supernatural phenomenon was at work, or whether he was simply afraid of his past crimes being exposed, remained unclear. Either way, he had tracked Walsh's progress through academic channels and finally eliminated him when his discoveries came too close to revealing the truth. Merritt was arrested and charged with Walsh's murder. The evidence connecting him to the 1971 disappearances was considered in sentencing, though the statute of limitations complicated those charges. He was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The remains of the 3 men found under the tower foundation were finally recovered and identified through DNA matching with surviving relatives, bringing closure to families who had wondered about their fate for over 40 years. As for Echo Lake itself, scientific analysis confirmed its unusual acoustic properties, the result of its unique geology and underground cave system. These natural features could indeed amplify and distort sounds in ways that might seem supernatural to those experiencing them without context. Sheriff Fletcher filed his final report on the case in November 2011, writing, "What began as a Cold War secret became a decades-long cover-up that claimed 4 lives. Whatever natural phenomena exist at Echo Lake served only to amplify the very human crimes committed there." Yet Fletcher would later admit to colleagues that he had never felt entirely comfortable with the resolution. Walsh's final recordings remained unexplained by mere acoustics, particularly the clarity with which the voice had seemed to address both Walsh and, through him, the authorities who would eventually bring justice to crimes long buried beneath Echo Lake's placid surface. The small town of Pinecrest, settled deep in the mountain forests of northern Idaho, had always been a quiet place, the kind of community where most residents never bothered locking their doors. Sheriff Mason Reed had served its 3,700 citizens for nearly 14 years, handling little more than occasional DUIs, minor property disputes, and the rare domestic disturbance. At 46, with graying temples and the weathered face of someone who spent most of his life outdoors, Reed was a fixture in Pinecrest, respected for his fairness and steady temperament. But in September 2018, the peaceful rhythms of Pinecrest were shattered when a seasonal forest worker discovered something horrifying while clearing brush near an old logging road 6 miles outside of town. A crude grave containing the remains of a young woman, partially unearthed by recent heavy rainfall. Sheriff Reed secured the scene immediately, calling in the state forensics team. The victim had been buried for approximately 2 years, according to initial estimates. Cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the skull. Most disturbing was how the body had been positioned, hands crossed over the chest, with a small carved wooden figure of a pine tree placed between them. "I've never seen anything like this in all my years," Reed told his deputy, Mark Holloway, as they watched the forensics team work. Who would do something like this in Pinecrest? Within days, the victim was identified as Jessica Landon, a 23-year-old who had been reported missing from neighboring Clearwater County in July 2016. She had last been seen at a gas station in Pinecrest, where her car had broken down. According to the report, a helpful local had offered her a ride to the nearest mechanic, but she never arrived. As Reed delved deeper into the investigation, he discovered something that sent a chill through him. Jessica Landon wasn't the first young woman to go missing in the area. Over the past decade, 4 other women between the ages of 19 and 25 had disappeared while passing through the region. 2 cases had been classified as runaways, one as a probable drowning in the nearby Clearwater River, though no body was recovered, and one remained an open missing persons case. Reed obtained permission to search the areas surrounding the first burial site, bringing in cadaver dogs from the state police. What they found confirmed his worst fears. 4 additional graves, arranged in a rough semicircle around a massive old-growth pine tree. Each contained remains in similar states of decomposition, hands crossed, with the same wooden pine tree figure placed with the bodies. The discovery sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community. State and federal authorities descended on Pinecrest, setting up a joint task force to investigate what was now clearly the work of a serial killer, one who had been operating undetected in their midst for years. As the most knowledgeable local law enforcement officer, Reed was integrated into the task force, working alongside FBI profilers. The profile they developed suggested someone intimately familiar with the forest, socially functional enough to gain the trust of strangers, and deeply connected to the Pinecrest area. The wooden carvings indicated ritual significance, possibly tied to local history or personal mythology. The 5 victims had little in common, beyond being young women traveling alone through the area. None had connections to Pinecrest itself. The killer appeared to be opportunistic, targeting vulnerable strangers rather than locals. As news of the discovery spread, Reed noticed subtle changes in town. Residents who had once greeted him warmly now seemed guarded. Conversations at the local diner fell silent when he entered. He attributed it to the general atmosphere of fear and suspicion that had enveloped Pinecrest. 3 weeks into the investigation, Reed received an anonymous letter at the sheriff's office. "Sheriff, you're looking in the wrong places. Ask about the Woodsman's Festival of 1987 and why it stopped. Some traditions never really die." The Woodsman's Festival had been an annual town celebration until it was abruptly discontinued 31 years earlier. Most younger residents had never even heard of it. When Reed questioned older townspeople, he encountered awkward evasions and claims of poor memory. Finally, Eleanor Palmer, the 83-year-old former town librarian, agreed to speak with him in confidence. What she revealed changed the entire direction of the investigation. "The festival ended because of what happened to that girl," Palmer explained, her hands trembling around her teacup. "Marianne Schaefer. She was just passing through, had car trouble like the others. During the festival, there was a tradition where a young woman would be chosen as the forest bride. Just symbolic, you understand. But that year, some of the men had been drinking heavily. They took the tradition too far, took her into the forest as part of the ceremony. Something went wrong. They came back without her." According to Palmer, the town's leaders, including the sheriff at that time, covered up the incident. Marianne Schaefer was reported as having continued her journey. The festival was quietly canceled, and the matter was never spoken of again. "Everyone who was directly involved is dead now," Palmer told him. "But there was a boy, about 13 then, who followed the men into the forest that night. He saw everything. Thomas Garrett. He still lives up on Ridge Road." Thomas Garrett, now in his 50s, owned the largest lumber supply business in the county. He was a prominent citizen, a generous donor to local causes, and a regular attendee at town council meetings. He also served as a volunteer search and rescue coordinator, intimately familiar with the forests where the bodies had been found. Reed began quietly investigating Garrett, discovering that he lived alone in his family's original homestead, a large property bordering national forest land, less than 2 miles from where the graves had been discovered. More significantly, each of the 5 victims had last been seen on days when Garrett's lumber business was closed and his whereabouts unaccounted for. Rather than confronting Garrett directly, Reed convinced the task force to put him under surveillance while they gathered more evidence. On the 4th night of surveillance, Garrett was observed loading something heavy into his truck before driving into the forest along an unmarked logging road. The team followed at a distance, watching as he parked, and proceeded on foot deep into the woods, carrying what appeared to be a shovel. What they witnessed next would haunt Reed for years to come. In a small clearing surrounded by ancient pines, Garrett had prepared a grave. But he wasn't alone. Bound and unconscious beside the hole was a young woman, later identified as Amber Reynolds, a college student who had been reported missing that morning after her car was found abandoned at a rest stop outside Pinecrest. The task force moved in quickly, arresting Garrett before he could harm Reynolds. At Garrett's property, investigators discovered a hidden room beneath his workshop containing damning evidence. Personal items belonging to each victim, journals detailing his actions, and dozens of the carved wooden pine trees in various stages of completion. The journals revealed the disturbing evolution of a killer. After witnessing Marianne Schaefer's death in 1987, Garrett had been both traumatized and fascinated. The town's successful cover-up taught him a powerful lesson about secrets and silence. As an adult, he began reenacting and perfecting a distorted version of the ritual he had witnessed, seeing himself as continuing a tradition that connected him to the forest and the town's hidden history. Most disturbing to Reed was the realization that subtle clues had been present for years. Women reported a helpful local offering assistance, Garrett's unusual interest in missing persons cases, his extensive knowledge of remote areas where searches were conducted. In retrospect, the signs seemed obvious, but in the context of a trusted community member, they had gone unnoticed. During interrogation, Garrett spoke calmly about his actions, describing them as honoring the forest through proper brides, unlike the mistake of 1987. He expressed surprise at being caught, admitting he believed some townspeople had suspected him but chosen to look the other way, just as they had with the original incident that inspired his crimes. This suggestion led to a wider investigation into the 1987 cover-up. While most participants were deceased, enough evidence emerged to implicate several current elderly residents in obstructing justice. The town was forced to confront its role in enabling Garrett's crimes through silence and willful ignorance. For Sheriff Reed, the case represented a profound betrayal, not just by Garrett, but by the community and the office he had served. The previous sheriff, his own mentor, had been complicit in covering up Marianne Schaefer's death, creating the conditions that allowed Garrett's pathology to develop and flourish. Garrett was eventually convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder, receiving consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Amber Reynolds recovered from her ordeal physically, though the psychological impacts would require years of therapy. In the aftermath, Reed faced a difficult decision. Many urged him to resign, arguing that the department needed a fresh start untainted by the case. Others insisted he was the only person who could rebuild trust in local law enforcement precisely because he had brought the truth to light. After weeks of reflection, Reed chose to remain as sheriff, implementing comprehensive reforms, including a cold case review protocol, mandatory reporting of all suspicious incidents, regardless of who was involved, and regular outside audits of department practices. What happened here wasn't just about one disturbed individual, Reed told the town at a community meeting. It was about a culture of silence that valued comfort over truth, protection of our own over justice for strangers. That changes now, or I walk away. Pinecrest slowly began to heal, though the case left lasting scars on the community's perception of itself. Tourism declined sharply, and some families chose to move away, unable to reconcile themselves with their hometown's dark secrets. For years afterward, hikers reported finding small carved wooden pine trees along trails in the national forest, tributes left anonymously for the victims. Sheriff Reed would personally collect and remove each one, keeping his own silent vigil for those who had died because too many people had chosen not to see what was happening beneath the silent pines. Though Garrett's reign of terror had ended, Reed often found himself looking more closely at familiar faces, wondering what other secrets might be hiding behind the neighborly smiles of Pinecrest. The forest that had once seemed protective now felt watchful, a silent witness to both past crimes and the fragile promise of justice finally served. On the night of November 17, 2007, Sheriff Ethan Blackwood of Crawford County, Kentucky, received a call that would mark the beginning of the most disturbing case of his 18-year career. At 51, Blackwood was a respected figure in the rural county of just under 15,000 residents, a seasoned law enforcement officer known for his methodical approach and unflappable demeanor. The call came from Martha Jennings, an elderly widow who lived alone on a remote property at the edge of Shawnee National Forest. Her voice trembling, she reported seeing someone standing motionless at the tree line behind her house, a tall figure who had remained in the same position for over 3 hours, seemingly watching her home. "Been there since sunset, Sheriff," she told Blackwood. "Doesn't move, not even when I flashed my porch lights or called out. Just stands there watching. I'm scared to go to sleep." Blackwood dispatched Deputy Lisa Harmon to investigate, expecting it to be nothing more than a deer misidentified in the darkness, or perhaps a hunter who had strayed onto private property. 20 minutes later, Harmon radioed back, her typically composed voice now tense. "Sheriff, you need to see this yourself. There's definitely someone out here, but something's not right." When Blackwood arrived at the Jennings property, Harmon directed his attention to the forest edge, roughly 200 yards from the house. In the beam of his spotlight stood a figure that, at first glance, appeared to be a man of unusual height, at least 6.5 feet tall, wearing what looked like dark clothing. But as Blackwood studied it more carefully, he noticed disturbing details. The figure remained completely motionless, despite the bright light. Its proportions seemed slightly wrong. Arms too long, torso too narrow. Most unsettling was its face, or rather, the absence of distinguishable facial features in the spotlight's glare. "We've called out multiple times," Harmon explained quietly. No response. I approached to about 50 yards before I got a really bad feeling and decided to wait for backup. Blackwood was not a superstitious man, but something about the scene raised the hair on the back of his neck. He radioed for additional deputies while he and Harmon began a cautious approach, weapons drawn. At approximately 100 yards, the spotlight still trained on the figure. Something unexpected happened. It moved. Not a step or a turn, but a strange fluid tilting of its entire form, as if leaning forward to get a better look at the approaching officers. "Crawford County Sheriff's Department," Blackwood called out. "Identify yourself." The figure made no response but tilted further, at an angle that seemed physiologically impossible without falling. Then, in a movement so swift that both officers momentarily lost visual tracking, it retreated into the forest. A thorough search of the area yielded nothing except a patch of disturbed ground where the figure had stood. A perfect circle approximately 3 feet in diameter, where the fallen leaves had been brushed away, revealing bare soil beneath. No footprints led to or from this circle, despite the damp ground that should have preserved tracks. Blackwood filed a report, classifying the incident as suspicious activity, unidentified trespasser. He assured Martha Jennings that additional patrols would monitor her property for the next few nights. Privately, he suspected the figure might have been someone in an elaborate costume, perhaps a local troublemaker attempting to frighten the elderly woman. 3 nights later, a similar report came in from the Thompson family, who lived approximately 7 miles from the Jennings property. They described an unnaturally tall figure standing at the edge of their property, watching their home for several hours before disappearing. The children had named it the Watchman, claiming they had seen it on previous nights, but had been afraid to tell their parents. Over the next 2 weeks, 11 more sightings were reported across the county, all sharing the same details. An unnaturally tall, thin figure, standing motionless for hours, always observing a home from a distance, retreating when approached, and leaving a circular area of disturbed ground. The sightings formed a rough clockwise pattern around the county, as if the figure were making a deliberate circuit of the region. Local media picked up the story, dubbing the mysterious observer the Crawford Watchman. Social media speculation ran wild, with theories ranging from an escaped psychiatric patient to elaborate pranks by local teenagers. Some residents claimed to have photographed the figure, though the images were invariably too blurry or distant to provide conclusive evidence. Sheriff Blackwood maintained a skeptical public stance, urging residents to remain calm while his department investigated. Privately, however, the pattern of sightings and consistent descriptions from reliable witnesses troubled him deeply. Whatever was happening transcended simple explanation. The case took a darker turn in early December when Martha Jennings, the first to report a sighting, was found dead in her home. The cause appeared to be natural: heart failure in an 82-year-old woman with a history of cardiac issues. But certain details disturbed the responding officers. Every window blind in the house had been closed and secured from the inside. More strangely, a circle of small objects, buttons, coins, and pebbles, had been arranged on her bedside table, mirroring the circular pattern found at the Watchman's sighting locations. The medical examiner ruled the death as natural causes, finding no evidence of foul play. The arranged objects were dismissed as an elderly woman's eccentricity. Blackwood might have accepted this explanation had similar deaths not followed. Over the next month, 3 more elderly residents who had reported Watchman sightings died in their homes. All appeared to be natural causes: 2 heart attacks and a stroke. And all featured the same peculiar details: secured windows and small objects arranged in a circular pattern near the deceased. By January 2008, fear had taken hold of Crawford County. Residents formed neighborhood watches. Some families temporarily relocated to stay with relatives outside the area. Blackwood requested assistance from state police, who assigned a special investigator, Dr. Catherine Chen, a criminal psychologist with expertise in community-based hysteria and pattern crimes. Dr. Chen's initial assessment suggested a phenomenon known as mass psychogenic illness, essentially a form of collective anxiety manifesting in shared delusions and stress-induced health emergencies. The Watchman, she theorized, might have begun as an actual trespasser or unusual natural occurrence, but had evolved into a community-wide fear response amplified by media coverage and social contagion. This explanation accounted for the sightings and potentially even the deaths, as elderly individuals with pre-existing conditions might succumb to the extreme stress of believing they were being watched or targeted. It did not, however, explain the consistent physical evidence, the circular clearings, or how individuals who died had managed to arrange objects beside themselves after suffering catastrophic medical events. As winter deepened, sightings decreased, which Dr. Chen attributed to normal waning of mass hysteria events. Blackwood was less convinced, noting that the reduction coincided with residents largely abandoning isolated behaviors, like walking alone after dark or sleeping in rooms with uncovered windows. In late February, while reviewing case files, Blackwood noticed something that had previously escaped attention. Mapping the Watchman sightings chronologically revealed Not just a clockwise pattern around the county, but a spiral gradually moving inward. If the pattern continued, it predicted the next sightings would occur near the county center, specifically in Millfield, the county seat where Blackwood himself lived. The night after this discovery, Blackwood woke at 3:17 a.m. with an inexplicable certainty that something was wrong. Looking out his bedroom window, he saw it, the tall, unnaturally thin figure standing at the edge of his property, visible in the moonlight. Unlike previous reports where the figure stood facing homes, this time it appeared to be looking directly at Blackwood himself, as if aware of his specific location in the house. Gathering his service weapon and radio, Blackwood moved quietly through his home, observing the figure from different windows. It remained motionless, except to pivot slightly, always maintaining its focus on his position, regardless of which room he entered. It seemed to be tracking him specifically, not just watching the house. Blackwood called for backup, but decided not to wait, determined to confront whatever or whoever had been terrorizing his county. He exited through his back door, circling wide to approach the figure from behind. What happened next would become the subject of extensive debate and investigation. By Blackwood's official account, he managed to approach within 15 yards of the figure before it detected him. When it turned, his flashlight illuminated it clearly for the first time, revealing something that, in his words, wore the rough shape of a man, like an ill-fitting suit. Its movements as it fled were described as unfolding rather than running, covering ground with impossible speed. The responding deputies found Blackwood in a state of unusual distress. They documented the now familiar circular clearing where the figure had stood, but this time noted additional evidence: a fine, powdery substance covering the bare soil within the circle. Samples were collected and sent to the state forensics lab, where analysis identified it as a mixture of human ashes and clay native to the region, but not present in Blackwood's yard soil. In the weeks that followed, something changed in Sheriff Blackwood. He became intensely focused on historical research, spending hours in the county archives and consulting with local historians and archaeological experts from the university in Louisville. He shared little of his findings with his department, claiming he was exploring a new angle that required verification before broader discussion. State Investigator Chen, concerned about Blackwood's behavior, requested a formal psychological evaluation. Blackwood cooperated, but continued his investigation, now concentrating on land ownership records dating back to the county's formation in the 1790s and earlier Native American settlements in the region. The breakthrough, or breakdown, depending on various accounts, came in April 2008. Blackwood called an emergency meeting with his senior deputies, Dr. Chen, and representatives from the Historical Society. He laid out an elaborate theory, connecting the Watchman sightings to what he described as territorial sentinel behavior, tied to ancient burial practices of the Shawnee people who had once inhabited the region. According to Blackwood, construction projects and development over the past decade had disturbed several unmarked burial sites. The circular patterns matched ceremonial clearings, documented in archaeological studies. Most controversially, he suggested the deaths were not coincidental, but deliberate, claiming the Watchman was reclaiming its watchers, elderly residents whose life energy somehow sustained it. Dr. Chen immediately recommended Blackwood take medical leave, which he reluctantly accepted. 2 weeks into his absence, however, he disappeared from his home, leaving behind his service weapon, badge, and a room covered in maps, historical documents, and connecting threads, a physical manifestation of his increasingly paranoid theories. A multi-agency search focused on the national forest areas where the first sightings had occurred. 5 days into the search, volunteer teams discovered a clearing deep in the forest, unlike any previously documented. A perfect circle, approximately 30 feet in diameter, where the ground had been methodically cleared of all vegetation. At its center sat Blackwood's county-issued flashlight, still functioning, illuminating a circular arrangement of small river stones. Blackwood himself was never found. The official report concluded he had experienced a severe psychological break triggered by stress and sleep deprivation, likely wandering deeper into the forest, where he succumbed to exposure or injury. The Watchman sightings were officially attributed to a combination of actual trespassers, wildlife misidentifications, and mass hysteria, amplified by community tension. Case closed, at least officially. Unofficially, Crawford County residents still report occasional sightings of an unusually tall figure watching from a distance, though none have been verified. The 4 deaths remain classified as natural causes despite their unusual circumstances. Perhaps most unsettling is what happened to the evidence. The ash and clay samples from Blackwood's yard disappeared from the state lab, listed as incorrectly cataloged. The maps and documents from his home were destroyed in a small fire attributed to faulty wiring. Dr. Chen's full psychological assessment remains sealed by court order. Deputy Lisa Harmon, who assumed the position of interim sheriff following Blackwood's disappearance, maintains the only copy of his complete case notes. She has never publicly discussed their contents, but has instituted one unusual departmental policy. All Crawford County deputies are required to document and investigate any reported clearing found in the woods, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Some patterns, she reportedly told a new deputy who questioned the protocol, aren't meant to be completed. Sheriff Drew Callahan had been the chief law enforcement officer in Sparrow County, Ohio, for 11 years. At 47, he was a pragmatic, no-nonsense investigator with a reputation for thoroughness and impartiality. His jurisdiction encompassed 720 square miles of mostly rural countryside, small farming communities, and the county seat of Hollowbrook, population 8,200. Like many small-town sheriffs, Callahan dealt primarily with domestic disputes, petty theft, and occasional drug offenses. Serious crimes were rare in Sparrow County. That changed on March 4, 2019, when a land surveyor working in an abandoned limestone quarry 5 miles outside Hollowbrook discovered human remains, partially embedded in a concrete slab. The initial excavation revealed not one body, but 3, all adult males, all bearing signs of violent death, and all encased in what appeared to be deliberately poured concrete that had hardened around them. Forensic analysis determined the men had been dead for approximately 10 to 15 years. All 3 had been bound before death, and each had suffered multiple blunt force traumas. Most disturbingly, evidence suggested they had been placed in the concrete while still alive, their desperate movements creating air pockets and distortions in the material as it hardened around them. The investigation immediately became the most complex of Callahan's career. None of the victims matched any local missing persons reports from the relevant time period. DNA testing yielded no hits in national databases. The quarry had been abandoned in 2001 when the operating company declared bankruptcy, leaving behind equipment, including a small concrete mixer, likely used in the killings. Whoever did this, Callahan told reporters at a press conference, wasn't just a killer. They wanted these men to suffer and wanted to ensure they'd never be found. Only chance exposed this crime. The case might have gone cold immediately, if not for an unexpected development. 3 days after the discovery was reported in local media, Sheriff Callahan received a handwritten letter delivered to his office. Sheriff, the men in the quarry were not the first, And they weren't the last. There are 7 more sites around the county. I know because I helped him. I kept his secret for 17 years, but I can't anymore. If you want to find the others, look beneath the old Parkman Bridge. Come alone, or I won't show myself. A witness. Callahan considered the letter likely a hoax. Such cases often attracted attention seekers and false confessions. Nevertheless, he couldn't ignore a potential lead in a triple homicide. Following protocol, he arranged for 2 deputies to position themselves covertly near the mentioned location, an abandoned railroad bridge spanning Crow Creek at the county's western edge, while he approached openly. The meeting yielded no immediate contact, but as Callahan prepared to leave, he discovered a sealed plastic container hidden beneath loose stones at the bridge's base. Inside was a hand-drawn map marking 7 locations across Sparrow County, along with a typed note. I watched you arrive with backup. I understand, but it means I can't trust you yet. The map shows where the others are buried, 17 in total. Check the location nearest the water tower first. When you find them, I'll know I can trust you, and I'll explain everything. I'm sorry I helped him. I was young and afraid. Callahan immediately secured the scene and initiated a careful excavation at the location indicated near Hollowbrook's water tower, an overgrown lot that had once held a machine shop before being abandoned in the early 2000s. 2 days into the dig, investigators made a grim discovery. Another concrete slab, this one containing 2 female victims, estimated to have been dead 15 to 18 years. The subsequent investigation confirmed the map's horrifying accuracy. Over the following month, excavations at the marked locations revealed a total of 16 additional victims, 9 men and 7 women, all encased in similar concrete slabs, all bearing evidence of torture before death. The chronology suggested the killings had occurred between 1998 and 2005, then abruptly stopped. The scale of the discovery stunned the quiet county. State and federal authorities joined the investigation, bringing resources far beyond what Callahan's small department could muster. DNA analysis eventually identified 11 of the 19 total victims. Most were transients, hitchhikers, or individuals estranged from families who had never reported them missing. Several had criminal records for minor offenses like drug possession or petty theft. As the identification process continued, Callahan received another communication, a disposable cell phone delivered to his home mailbox with a text message already on the screen. "You found them all now. I'm ready to talk. Drive to Campbell's abandoned farm tonight at 10. Come alone. I'll be watching to make sure." Against the advice of the state investigators, who wanted to set up a tactical operation, Callahan decided to honor the request for a solo meeting. His reasoning was simple. Whoever had provided the map clearly had intimate knowledge of the crimes, but had not participated in the most violent aspects, based on the regretful tone of the messages. If spooked, they might disappear, taking crucial evidence with them. At the designated time, Callahan arrived at the dilapidated Campbell property, a foreclosed farm that had stood empty for nearly a decade. Following instructions texted to the disposable phone, he parked in the overgrown driveway and waited with his headlights off. After 20 minutes, a figure emerged from the darkness. A woman in her late 30s, thin and nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder. She identified herself as Elaine Morgan. "I helped him move and bury the bodies," she stated without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never killed anyone, I swear it. But I knew what he was doing, and I didn't stop him. I was 17 when it started. He was 36. The he in question was Robert Egan, a concrete contractor who had been Elaine's neighbor and later partner. According to her account, Egan had methodically abducted and murdered his victims over a 7-year period, targeting individuals he believed wouldn't be missed, primarily drifters passing through the area or those living on society's margins. He called it cleansing, Elaine explained, visibly shaking as she recounted the details. Said he was removing human waste from the world. He'd keep them in the storm cellar at his property, for days sometimes, before taking them to wherever he'd prepared a form for the concrete. Most disturbing was her explanation of why the killings had stopped in 2005. Robert Egan hadn't had a change of heart or feared capture. He had died of a massive heart attack while working at a construction site. Following his death, Elaine had inherited his property and lived there in seclusion, carrying the burden of her knowledge and complicity. "I should have come forward years ago," she admitted. "But I was afraid of prison, afraid of what people would think. Then last month I was diagnosed with terminal cancer. 6 months to live, maybe less. I can't die with this secret anymore." Callahan placed Elaine Morgan under arrest, reading her rights before transporting her to the county jail. Her formal confession, recorded over 2 days, provided horrifying details of Egan's methodology and victims. She led investigators to Egan's former property, now hers, where a search of the storm cellar revealed a makeshift torture chamber, preserved almost exactly as it had been at the time of his death. Most valuable to the investigation was a journal Elaine provided from Egan's personal effects, in which he had meticulously documented each killing, including details not released to the public and known only to the killer. The journal contained information about all 19 victims, confirming Elaine's claim that they had uncovered the full extent of his crimes. The case that had begun with a surveyor's grim discovery concluded with Elaine Morgan pleading guilty to 19 counts of accessory after the fact to murder, along with failure to report criminal activity and improper disposal of human remains. In consideration of her cooperation, terminal illness, and the psychological control Egan had exerted over her from a young age, she received a sentence of 20 years, with possibility of parole after 7. The victims were finally laid to rest in proper graves, their remains released to families where possible, or interred in a special memorial erected in Hollowbrook Cemetery, funded by county residents who wished to acknowledge the tragedy that had unfolded undetected in their community. For Sheriff Callahan, the case left permanent scars. The knowledge that a serial killer had operated in his jurisdiction for years without detection, while he had been a deputy and later sheriff, weighed heavily on him. More troubling were the implications about how society views its most vulnerable members. As he noted in his final case report, these 19 people vanished from the world without raising alarms because too many of them existed on the periphery of our attention. Their invisibility in life facilitated their disappearance in death. The case prompted significant changes in how Sparrow County approached missing persons reports, especially involving transient or marginalized individuals. Callahan instituted mandatory follow-up protocols regardless of the person's background or circumstances, and established better coordination with surrounding counties and states. Robert Egan's former property was eventually seized by the county and demolished, the land converted into a nature preserve with a small, understated memorial to the victims. The limestone quarry where the first bodies were discovered was permanently sealed. Elaine Morgan died in prison 14 months after her sentencing, her cancer having progressed more rapidly than doctors initially predicted. Before her death, she met with several victims' families who sought closure, providing details about their loved ones' final days that, while painful, helped them understand the full truth. The case of the concrete killer, as it became known nationally, serves as a chilling reminder of how easily evil can hide in plain sight in rural communities, where isolation and privacy can create perfect conditions for predators. It also stands as testimony to how a guilty conscience, even one that waited 17 years to speak, ultimately ensured that 19 forgotten victims were finally remembered and honored in death, as they should have been in life. Sheriff Callahan continued to serve Sparrow County until his retirement in 2023, 4 years after closing the county's most horrific case. He rarely spoke publicly about the investigation, but colleagues noted that he never again passed a construction site with wet concrete without pausing, however briefly, as if listening for echoes of those who had been silenced beneath the gray, hardening surface. Thanks for watching. Huge thanks for all your support. The likes, the comments, everything really helps the channel grow. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. I always read them. And of course, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new videos. See you next time.